Hey everyone, that's prep finished.
Just letting both teams know that live stream is already on. Thank you.
Great. Are both teams there? Yep, next year. Affirmative. Affirmative, they're there. My panel here, yes, looks like it. Okay, everyone's here. I think we'll start with introductions then. My name's Luke, I'm chairing, my pronouns are he and they. I invite my panel to introduce themselves and then the teams. And for the teams as well, can I please get the motion and each team's vetoes?
Yeah, hi, I'm Banun, no preference.
Hi, I'm Livy, she, they.
All right, neg. Great. So we're doing motion, the bottom motion about men and women, about returning the normal families. We are being streamed, so and there are observers. So I would like to remind the observers to please keep your cameras off and your microphones off at all times. But I think with anything else, we're ready to start. I invite first affirmative to open the debate.
Hello, can I be heard and seen?
Yeah.
All right, great. Just give me a sec. All right, if I get cut off at any point in time, just feel free to interrupt me and let me know that you can't hear me. Other than that, I'll start in 3, 2, 1. What are the current determinants of choice with regards to working? We think that there are broadly 2 factors. The first is social norms, which are essentially the roles that are ascribed to people, which means that you either assume that one person ought to work and the other ought to stay at home. That's the first broad level that determines this. The second are economic norms, which means, do I work or is there someone better suited to work other than me in this situation? These are the 2 broad factors that determine which specific person works in the household. What do we posit? We think that the motion assumes equal likelihood. There's fiat in the motion, which means that equal likelihood can only exist when there is no overwhelming bias with regards to who ought to work in this world. So that means 3 things. Number 1, we think that both staying at home and working outside of home are degendered concepts, which means there's no overwhelming bias with regards to one particular gender as to who works and who stays at home, which means that Nick cannot come and say that, there will be a lot of social narratives with regards to who does what. Second, this means that there's no overwhelming pressure of men in particular to earn money, right? Because everything is degendered. So you ought not to pressurize individuals with regard to who works. And thirdly, we think that these individuals then are likelier to earn the same amount of money because the economic norms of do I work or does someone else work is largely mitigated in the status quo. So as a result of that, I have a couple of clarifications first to posit. Number one, we think that in this world as well, you can have home-based work, which means in general, the world is moving towards hybrid ways of earning, like small businesses, freelancing, or running boutiques from home, etc. This means we think that we can also have things like if you need that extra amount of money or whatever in the worst case that Nick talks about, we think you can also have that. We think the comparative is maybe you earn slightly less amount of money, but you can still earn that one. But why do we think this is comparable to status quo? Because even in status quo, we don't necessarily think that under most circumstances, both parents do equal work in terms of earning anyway, right? Because of the economic norms that exist, which posits how much money you get anyway, this means that it is very mitigatory. This means ultimately the marginal cost of money is actually very, very little under NEG's world anyway. Great. So what am I going to talk about here? I'm going to talk about a couple of things. Firstly, let's talk a little bit about all right, so the first thing to posit here is that we think that the most important actor in this motion is essentially the child. And we're going to talk about why, because the child is the most important actor, we ought to protect them, even if it comes at the cost of the parents. So a couple of things then. Number one, we think money is essentially the means to make your life better, but the damage that you do to your child as a way of earning that money is essentially irreparable. Number two, we think most individuals have kids in the early stages of your career. Hence, you earn relatively less around the first stages when you have that child. And then when you start earning enough money, the damage that you do is essentially irreparable, damage that I will illustrate a little bit later. Thirdly, we think the problem is money in general often damages children to begin with. So people think that money is the only way to make the child happy, and that you never build meaningful relationships. Great. Then let's talk about children. We think that children in general are the most vulnerable actors in the world for a couple of reasons. Number one, we think that children, essentially their existence is built without their consent. They have come into the world and they had no choice in the matter. So this means that they exist completely based on the whims of two other adults and they had no say in this. Number two, we think children in general are incredibly dependent, especially when they're very, very young. They literally cannot operate without the support of other people, which means then every action of theirs ought to be supported by an external actor, and who that external actor is matters a lot in developing them later on. Number three, we think children in general, especially when they're young, are incredibly vulnerable. This is for a lot of reasons, also because of the dependency factor, but mostly because their cognitive abilities are not fully developed. This means they can be influenced by a lot of other individuals and they cannot protect themselves to the best of their ability. They don't have a lot of ways to defend themselves against those bad influences, which means that they're very, very easy to manipulate, especially when they're very young, because they're very susceptible to suggestions and they're very susceptible and they want validation, etc. All of this means then they can do things at a young age that irreversibly damages them, like doing drugs, like skipping school, like hanging out with the wrong crowd, etc. And then they will have no capacity to get back when they get older as a result of this. So how do children suffer, especially in NEG's world or in a world where both parents work? And why are those harms incredibly pervasive for their children? You have to recognize that in general, companies necessarily don't give mothers long maternity leaves. And as a result of this, there's overwhelming pressure for women to go back to work immediately after giving birth, especially because they assume that if they take long leaves, they might lose their job or they might not get promoted, etc. Which means that the social norm created is essentially of that where you are not able to care for your newborn baby, specifically because there's a narrative that you ought to go back to work as soon as possible if you want to keep things like having promotions, etc., and climbing up that corporate ladder. All right, so why is this important? Because this means vast majority of parents then leave their incredibly young children towards alternatives in a world where both parents work. What do these alternatives look like? Number one, they could be daycare centers, but we think vast majority of places don't actually have daycare centers. Number two, it could be nannies, but we think vast majority of people can't afford nannies. But even if they could, we think in general, most parents leave their children to like with adults that they trust. So this could be neighbors, this could be nannies if you can afford it, or other relatives. Why is this still problematic? Not just because the ways in which those individuals are going to raise their child is not going to be exactly the way that you wanted it, but also because the way in these people raise their children is through a very pragmatic lens, which means babysitters and nannies are only here for the money, which means that they don't really care about forming an incredibly strong emotional attachment to the child. But secondly, even neighbors and relatives, oftentimes because they themselves can be really busy, etc., they look at it through a pragmatic lens, which means I have to feed the child, I have to make sure that they're well rested, and that's it. There is no added incentive to ensure that the moral compass of the child is very built up, or that you follow or have healthy attachments with that child, which means this child still grows up isolated and desolate. This means these individuals don't particularly care to make the child feel loved. This actually causes irreparable damage when the child is growing up. Why? We think we already gave a lot of analysis with regards to why children are incredibly vulnerable. But what does this translate into? Because you don't have the two individuals that you seek the most validation from, which are your parents, and you are only getting raised by individuals who are just here for the money or see you as a pragmatic thing that needs to be fed and well rested, and that's it. We think that there are a couple of things that happens. We think that the child grows up to be incredibly lonely with a lot of low self-esteem, and there's very low self-attachment, and you feel unloved by the two people that you love the most and seek the most amount of validation from. And then you see kids in school who are closer to their parents, and then you feel even worse because you're not sure why your parents don't love you enough to pick you up from school or drop you off in school, and that you're not sure why your parents can't help you with things like homework, etc. This means your mental health is irreparably damaged, especially in the years where you need that sense of support the most. This harms your ability to make meaningful connections, especially when you grow up, because a lot of sense of desolation stems from unhealthy attachment formed during childhood. So this irreparably damages your mental health. So as children grow up, they try to be even more like, then when children grow up, you try to make them more independent. So they stay home alone at ages five or six, and they rely less on parents. The problem is the world in general is built to ruin children. You start associating with people who are like you and who are rebels. You start associating with the wrong crowds, and you don't know any better because you were not taught any better. And this is easier to do to you because children are incredibly impressionable. This is problematic because number one, your moral teachings are weak because they were never enforced by your parents. And number two, once you realize this, it's already too late, but you don't feel close enough to your parents to talk about it. And hence a lot of that harms are irreparably done anyway. We think we ought to protect our children, even if it comes at the marginal cost. We are very proud to affirm.
First affirmative, and I invite first negative.
Hi, can I be heard?
Yeah.
Okay, just give me a second. Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. In this speech, I will do 3 things. First, some brief setup. Secondly, explaining why this makes life for the child and the family profoundly worse and profoundly more damaging. And thirdly, why this is terrible for the parent that gets left at home. Having said that, setup. The counterfactual is that given the motion emphasizes a return to the norm, this likely takes place in largely progressive societies that have moved past the gender imbalance in work, as we agree with AF. This debate exists in a world where men and women were equally likely to have negotiating power. So the difference is that the norm is that both worlds pursue. So they can't say we have to stick with the regressive world and they can pick this new fantasy world. So that means that there's still likely to be a fair balance of negotiation between men and women. In places where the norm is not one parent working, the norm is likely to be both parents working. Three reasons why. First, this is just an empirical observation. The rapidly increasing prevalence of 2-income households in Western countries like America, so it's already the present norm. So if AF is returning from a norm, the norm they are returning from is the norm we're defending. Secondly, the same advances in gender equality in AF's world have motivated an increase in workplace representation. So it's harder to ask men to give up on their jobs than it is to get women to take on jobs they've been lobbying for, which is why you're likely to see an increase in jobs as opposed to sort of a balancing of jobs. Thirdly, and lastly, is that economically, businesses and capitalist structures want to encourage 2-income households since more money and to consume and buy products. So what does it look like specifically? 1, parents equally sharing the burden of working and taking care of the child. 2, in many cases, an economy catering to childcare is likely to fill the demand out of the norm arising. So domestic work industry, babysitter apps, gig economy, nannies, and all the homework-based stuff that AF points out that makes it easy to take care of your kid because you can work from home. And thirdly, and lastly, is that further, it's likely that over time, government services expand and adapt to this norm, e.g. the creation of daycare services, expanded access to public schooling, because the norm requisitely increases the demand that people have for these services. I have 2 rebuttals. The first rebuttal is towards their squirrely claim that the marginal loss of a second income is not that much. First, their first claim to prove is that parents don't earn the same amount of money, so it's not that much of a loss. This is just really fake because, like, they're supposed to earn the same amount of money by construction, by their side's definition. They have to earn the same amount of money. 2, the marginal loss of a second income in the family. They say it's very little since you can work from home if you really need to, so you don't actually lose that much money. 1, observation. This is working, which is why it falls under our side of the house. So you would only really realistically have this option on our side, not on their side. As a second observation, since you lose this capacity to work early on in your career, you don't have the work skills or experience in a time of crisis, like losing the main breadwinner of the family, to be able to get the same amount of income to get back to your previous lifestyle, that you would be forced to do things like go into debt or be unable to pay rent, for the basic reason that the loss of a second income in the family doesn't just happen at the moment of time. It starts from the very beginning of that parental, child-parent relationship. So that's the first reason for why actually the marginal loss of a second income is quite large. The second thing they say is there's harm to the child because women don't get maternity leave for long, so they're forced to leave the kid, and so the kid does drugs and skips school. 1, when the kid is a baby, this is really not your main worry. 2, nannies and daycare centers are just asserted to be expensive or not exist. But notably, even if this was true, our norm makes it more common over time since the norm becomes increasingly expected. So they become more and more common. And even if they are expensive, the fact that you have a second income gives you the resources to pay for these nannies and other daycare centers. And 3, they give the response themselves, which is that you can work from home. So there's no reason to have to leave your kid away. So on our side, in addition, you don't feel bad that other kids in school have a better relationship with their family since this becomes a norm. So you see this more often with other kids in school. So if you don't have this relationship, you're the weird one. And in addition, you happen to expect it because it's a social norm as a child you expect. So even if it makes you absolutely more lonely, you don't actually feel more lonely because the actual experience is more meeting your expectations. Argument 1, the one income setup creates damaging tension in the family. We have 3 reasons why. 1, economic vulnerability. In a highly volatile global economy, the socio-economic position of the working class family is never assured. And at any moment, you can get laid off from your job, replaced by automation or outsourcing, fall ill, be the victim of a recession, and so on. This is terrible since when there's only one parent working, the entire family has to sacrifice their way of life. It's not just enough for the other parent to start working after the crisis. As we mentioned, deskilling means are unlikely to be employed, and there's a massive savings opportunity cost. On comparative, families on our side have a greater buffer against the host of risks they could fall prey to and have a greater ability to recover from. More savings to pay for rent, more capacity to have put food on the table and pay for the child's education. Further, when the comparative is both parents working, workplaces are more likely to adapt better norms that benefit everyone, granting more paternity leave and maternity leave because you expect both parents to work rather than just saying one of them can stay home, so you don't need to increase it, and decreasing working hours, improving the norm that you have to give people more time to spend with their families. So it's for this reason that if the problem on AF is so bad, the norm will accommodate for it, which is why you're likely to experience less of these harms. Whereas on our side, you're capable of coping with the economic vulnerability that leaves families systemically at risk of poverty and falling into debt. Secondly, though, on personal crisis, we also think that single income households are remarkably fragile since they're likely, again, to fall ill or get sick, maybe lose their job or get arrested or involved in some kind of incident, and they are definitively dependent on the health and well-being of the chosen breadwinner. This affects all families and provides a serious threat to the way of life of family that is now deprived of the main source of income, be unable to pay for the college, be unable to sustain their previous lifestyle. And we make the additional observation that this cleaves most keenly against low-income families that are most vulnerable to health risks like coal miners or construction workers, as well as ethnic minority groups that disproportionately experience more workplace discrimination, so are more likely to get fired, and also more discrimination at the hands of the police, so are more likely to get arrested. Which means that for these reasons, if you lose this particular breadwinner, specifically the vulnerable members of that minority group or vulnerable members of society are most likely to lose out on this important source of income and are most likely to plunge into poverty. Third thing, lastly, is that this leverage imbalance also destroys the family from the inside. You create economic imbalances where you become dependent on the breadwinner and have limited capacity to negotiate your share of domestic work, or in the worst case, leave the household. You want to have no new networks to get employed. 2, because of the inertia, it's difficult to start something new. And 3, you guilt trip. You view yourself as personally responsible for the child and will be told that failing them if you want to be more independent. So this emotional imbalance forces the child to naturally gravitate towards the parent who stays at home and sees the one who works as despondent. But further, because there's a lack of shared experience between the parents, it's difficult to resolve conflicts as compared to a world where they both sympathize with each other's difficulties. This means a couple of things. 1, spouses have less ability to check and balance each other, so there's no ability to push back against manipulation or leave a toxic partner. 2, resentment builds over time, which means that the family grows apart, bad for the child. Just because you split the duties equally doesn't mean that you feel the actual burdens are equal on one another, and one parent may feel like they're taking more of the burden than the other. And note the comparative is that what tears families apart is perceived unfairness, and that most parents see the other as being unfair. When one parent has more economic control over the spouse, the other thinks the child loves them more. We resolve that by pushing them towards an equal distribution of both kinds of work. And even in the worst case where there are fights, they're easier to resolve when parents perceive each other as equals and relate to each other's experiences. Even if AF says there's more childcare, we explain the setup, why these are logistical concerns that you can outsource or figure out. But on our side, you face irreparable emotional damage and severe financial shocks that are far more difficult for families to adjust to, and therefore are a much bigger harm. Their main harm and half weighing wise is that the child may not feel loved, which we mitigate to several degrees. But in addition, even if that was their main harm, this is far less than just being unable to pursue the lifestyle that you want. You're unable to become happy with yourself, and you're unable to put basic needs on the table. Secondly, though, this is also terrible for the parent that you leave at home, because regardless of norm, people will be trained for work. There's no certainty that like get married at all. There's still social norms that encourage a college education and for you to get educated and to work. This proves that independent of a norm of marriage, people will still place a value on pursuing a career. And the parent that stays at home is now given the responsibility of domestic work and child rearing that they are definitely not ready for, that they may take on a significant amount of work that had not been prepared for, that taking care of a child can genuinely be abusive. And parents on our side are now trained to ready themselves for work, but not all parents are ready to take on years of education on child rearing. And we can outsource these responsibilities to other professionals, but they're also forced to give up their dreams and ambitions that they have been pursuing since they were young. Just because they willingly gave this up in the relationship doesn't mean that they preferred it or that they are happy with it. Not only is this bad for the way that this parents find meaning, it's also bad for a potential source of resentment towards the family and towards a child that forces you to give up your dreams. In the worst case, you still make people deeply unhappy within their own families, within the own ambitions that they have in their own lives, as well as the future that they want to pursue. So for these reasons, you must negate. Thank you.
First negative, and I invite second affirmative to continue.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Fantastic. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Few pieces of framing to begin. First, let's deal with their best case of raising children, because they haven't responded to the idea that children are the most important stakeholders in this debate, purely based on the fact that they came into the world without consent. They are the most vulnerable. They are the most impressionable. And an added reason that I'm adding right now, they are the most utile actor that we need to protect, because they live the longest in this world and have the most to contribute to society. That's an additional reason why they're important. Since they've not broken this down, their best case of protecting this child is nannies and industries. We've already given you in first affirmative why on a comparative that is still, even in the best utopian world where it's insured for everybody, not likely to compensate for the needs this child has. First, because all of these actors, whether they're nannies or neighbors, are likely to be individuals that see the child as a transactional actor that they surely just need to protect by virtue of the financial compensation being paid to them. So the kinds of things they're likely to do are things that are the bare necessities that the parent has instructed them with, like give them food at the right time, or do things like, make sure they are safe at an early age. But this doesn't deal with the unique needs and the nuanced needs of affection that a child has that, if they do not receive, irreversibly damage them. Like the feeling of being loved, wanted, appreciated, talked to, having someone to support them through every step of the way, and truly feeling like this person is important to their lives. Their nannies are someone they see for 3 to 4 hours a day. Most of the time, the nanny doesn't pay them attention. It's something that they do, destroy the self-worth of this child through at an early age. Once the child goes up and grows up, if we're talking about vulnerable parents, there's an increasing incentive to not hire nannies and not take them to daycare centers, because you want them to become independent just like you are. So you let them go to school alone. You let them mix with your neighbors alone. That makes them prone to the society and other actors that are just like them and lonely, which tend to be also individuals that have that are impressionable at an early age and end up doing the bad things. So no, laughing at our argument is not a response, guys. This actor is important, and all of this does damage them. This already wins us the debate, because it is surely what you ought to weigh more than a mitigatory protection of the child through this. Now, let's assume this is not good enough for you, panel. Let's break each of their case one by one. The first thing they say is, we're increasingly making a trend where we continuously empower women to work and we provide things like daycare centers and nannies. The first thing I'd like to posit is there's an issue of demand and supply here. The demand for nannies in their world is literally every single household because everybody has kids and every single person needs a nanny to raise their child. The supply is surely not every single household because not everyone in the world wants to make nannies. So number one, nannies are exorbitantly expensive. Number two, there is an added, if you have to make sure that this is supplied and you also want to pay for it, that also takes away a lot of your income if you're already earning less. So 70% of your income goes to the bloody nanny. I'm not sure how much that protects you to begin with. The other responses we gave as a trade-off to your income is, number one, the incremental income at an early age, because you have a child at the early age, is likely to be less. You've not moved up in your career as much and you haven't earned as much. The response to work from home is work, guys. Like, okay, fine. Maybe you work at night when the child is asleep after you've taken care of it all day. Maybe you do things like small things like making, knitwear that you sell on Facebook that can also give you money. We're not arguing that this removes your ability, we're not arguing this doesn't reduce your money. It is some ability to make money that we still have on our side. But what you need to compare this money to is the irreversible damage that happens to the child once you earn money. So maybe you move up in your career, maybe you start earning money later on, but by then your child, who ends up becoming a part of the workforce and contributes to society, is already irreversibly damaged. That's something that you can't compensate for. The next thing they say is there's a lot of economic vulnerability in the world that we need to protect the world from. This is probably what they hedge as the most important part of their case, because families are vulnerable. Some person might lose their job. This becomes really terrible for them. The first thing I'd like to posit is, if this is true, which is there's an issue of food to mouth, I don't think they care about social norms at that point because it's a necessity of livelihoods. That's why if you look at Bangladesh, one of the most regressive conservative societies in the world that doesn't allow women to work, the vast majority of the garments workers we have are women because we realize that the poverty line is something they need to survive through. So their case doesn't apply in either world because, guys, these people are dying. They don't give a shit about social norms. Number two, if randomness is an issue, I think the randomness of unemployment is higher when you have a higher supply of labor. This is because you can always replace one worker with another because there's always someone else to employ. This means that even if you on net have higher income now, your ability to get replaced and your ability to live in anxiety because there's someone else to work and replace you is always going to be higher. So that creates a trend where they perpetually get exploited, have to work higher hours, longer hours, which ends up harming the child even more because they get to spend less time with their child. So if the argument is that they're dying, no, then social norms don't apply. If the argument is they work, but in this state, they live in a state of anxiety. The anxiety is made worse when they can be replaced perpetually by virtue of the supply of labor that exists in the labor market. I don't think this argument should have weight, but even if it does, I've just broken it down. What will I add in my speech? I'll talk about how fulfillment, by virtue of non-materialistic fulfillment, is a better version of fulfillment for parents than capitalistic fulfillment. The context is, surely the reason why both parents work right now is because they prioritize capitalistic fulfillment over non-materialistic fulfillment with their children. If that is the case, we think that the moment we pass our policy, there's a natural trend through which people start prioritizing a different kind of fulfillment, which is fulfillment at home, fulfillment by virtue of interacting with their child, that they are not prioritizing right now. So the trade-off, therefore, is materialistic fulfillment versus fulfillment with your child. The first thing I'd like to say with this is that it is really good to not have materialistic fulfillment spread out throughout the family because it is unlikely that both parents will succeed in pursuing that materialistic fulfillment. This is because capitalistic structures are designed to be zero-sum. Not everybody gets a promotion. Only one person out of 3 or 4 will. Not everybody gets higher pay. So when you start ascribing a lot of your self-worth to how much money you make within the family, it becomes perpetually more difficult for you to be confident as a parent because that puts you in a state of double punishment. Not only are you not taking care of the child, which is probably something you naturally would care about, you're also not getting fulfillment by what you ascribe to be more important, which is success in your career, which, by the way, assuming next analysis, ends up contributing to the child. So you feel like you failed the child by virtue of not getting more money, which the capitalistic structure makes you believe. Number two, the moment you have the same role, and this also directly engages first neg, that if you have the same role, you end up competing as parents because you both want to do the same thing for the child. Yes, maybe in a world in which you have two separate roles, you end up having a vague discussion on what role is valuable more. But at least you know your role and you don't have a basis of comparison against the other parent, your husband, in the attribution of that role. The vast majority of conservative societies, any child will say they're closer to their mom and they know for a fact that their mom has an active threat or an active contribution to their lives. The problem is when they both have equal roles in raising the child, there's a competition. Is the husband earning more or is the mother earning more? There's also a discussion on who makes the sacrifice, who takes a leave from a day of work to go with their child to the concert, or who does what. And this calculated calculus of trade-offs is where the relationship between both parents is also fractured because they see each other as competitors, not as individuals that need to complement each other in the raise of their children. What this concludes to is capitalism makes it difficult for families to survive because parents end up hating each other, getting divorced, which, by the way, harms the most important stakeholder in the debate, children. There is no way First Neg has anything left standing. We're clearly winning this debate, at least so far.
Second affirmative for that speech, and I invite second negative.
Hello. Oh, I'm so sorry. I realized I'm on the wrong Zoom. I'm gonna change my name. Can everyone hear me though?
Yeah.
All right, great. I'll just turn on my camera. I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. So I think AF is a very one-dimensional case. It is value neutral. The children are the most vulnerable actor in this debate. I have many responses to beat them from the onset. Firstly, we already flipped this claim from David, that parents fight because one can guilt trip the other because they contribute more economically, regardless of whether or not they're a man or a woman, and say that they are the breadwinner of the family. You have no right to make financial decisions. You have no right to determine where this money goes, because I'm the one that's working so hard to be able to earn it. And secondly, the other parent can say that their kid loves them more, that their kid is the one that has more affection for them. As Sajid just says, that a lot of people believe that they love their mother more than their father. And therefore, these are things that are likely to ensure there is infighting within parents, there is the scarring of family tensions, which ensures that it is much, much more difficult for children to be able to deal with increasing family tension, let alone the fact that these are people who have entirely different experiences and therefore have a difficulty relating, i.e. the working parent might not realize how hard domestic work might be. The domestic working parent might not realize that the person is mad or that the person is frustrated because they had a bad day at the office and might not know what that's like and therefore think they're being incredibly unreasonable. These two are incredibly emotionally damaging, and I would posit that this is a long-lasting harm because unlike child rearing, there are no alternatives to this. It is impossible for them to find a way to say there are other ways to fix a parent-to-parent relationship versus on our side of the house, when parents who obviously have the best interest of their child in mind maybe can pick daycare services that are more likely to be emotionally affectionate, maybe can pick close relatives that are more likely capable of being able to take care of the kid, etc. And therefore, these are alternatives that I agree might not be perfect, might not be apparent, but are far better able to adjust to, rather than ones where it is so difficult for parents to get along. And that is why within previous cultural norms, regardless of them being men or women or not, it was incredibly difficult to sustain a marriage. Most marriages end in divorce. I'll argue that an extension later. Secondly, just to mitigate this is an incredibly uncharitable characterization. A kid that is newborn has the least emotional capacity, and therefore the practical concerns with it are probably the most important. You don't remember anything until you're 3 years old. Secondly, and that's the thing, as they get older, they spend more and more time in school. They get more and more independent, which is why it becomes less and less important that parental presence is there. And moreover, this is the third thing, it becomes increasingly important as well that when the child gets older, the time in which you spend with your parent are also that are already afforded on our side of the house, i.e. parents might work a 9 to 5, and therefore after that they're ready for supper. Parents are free on the weekends, can spend leaves and holidays for important events for the kid. In fact, I'd flip this. A parent with the sole responsibility of being a breadwinner in the family has to work longer, work overtime, take on holidays, and therefore if you see that one parent is around and not the other, especially for longer and longer and longer, there's the feeling of abandonment. The feeling that your parents might not get along and therefore they don't really want to be around each other, which is why one parent is not at home as much as he often can. And therefore, in our world, it is a lot easier to be able to mend these kinds of difficulties. Versus in their world, a child is more likely to receive this negatively. But thirdly, it's a lot easier to deal with the negative external influences on their side of the house when you have an increased income. Because you might be able to move to a better neighborhood that is less crime-ridden. You might be able to send your kid to a better school where there are better facilities for maybe their mental health, where you're less likely to interact with kids and teachers know how to deal with troubled kids and therefore are better able to manage these kinds of different child emotions. Or guys, being incredibly economically insecure is an incredibly anxiety-giving and like damaging experience to someone's mental health. The worry of death, the worry of not knowing where your next meal might come from, and especially when you notice a lot of what David talks about are both larger macroeconomic claims of global instability with respect to markets, but also things that just happen to you personally. If your parent gets sick, if they get in an accident, especially for manual laborers, if your parent gets laid off because your company's downsizing, these are things that are very difficult for AF to be able to secure. At best, they say, well, you can still work from home. Not only is this crossing the floor, the point at which you could work from home is either so small because it is after all your responsibilities, or you forgo these child-rearing responsibilities and forgo their benefit. Weighing. One, they don't respond to our emotional claims, and therefore they can't just prove kids are important. We say they're emotionally damaged on our side as well, in fact, to a greater extent. But note that we mitigated the lack of a parental presence. But moreover, that as the kid gets more mature, it becomes easier to justify to yourself, my dad or my mom was not around because they loved me so much and needed to work hard. Versus, it's so difficult to justify that your parents were always fighting. So difficult to understand that they might not love each other as a consequence. But moreover, even the practical economic decisions that you're now able to make with two incomes are things you can't undo or unlearn in the future. You can't undo what school you went to and therefore you went to a bad university. You can't undo the neighborhood you lived in and therefore would have never joined a gang or all the other negative influences. You have the ability to prevent those things from happening to begin with a higher income. Secondly, child rearing services are expensive. One, insofar as there's a higher demand, there are many industries in the world with a high demand. Insofar as many different firms identify this, it is more likely they enter and therefore would also provide the corollary supply. And as a consequence, it's unclear as to whether or not this price would have been so expensive. Insofar as many firms would have wanted to capitalize on such a high demand, competition exists. There are many things in the world that had initially high demand, get cheaper over time. Secondly, I actually argue this is good, not the high demand. Well, I guess the high demand. But I suppose just everyone being interested in child rearing services as an industry ensures that you have more and more people being trained to know how to deal with children, more and more people who are being trained to understand how to provide emotional support for children, more and more research, more and more professionals. And therefore, I'd argue are far better than a parent who has no idea how to do this. And this is the next thing I want to rebut. Why do parents have no idea how to be able to stay at home? Because they just assert, if you don't care about a job or capitalistic fulfillment, you love your family even more. Absurd. Because there are many reasons capitalistic fulfillment would exist on either side of the house, just that they can't fulfill them on their side of the house. Because, one, you have no certainty that you're even going to get married at all. So you can't just start to love domestic household work when you have to take care of yourself and become self-sufficient. But two, even in the interim period, as people, millennials especially, are getting married older and older and older, you need to have some way to be able to sustain yourself. You can't just hope you marry to the right person. And therefore, you still need a lot of that capitalistic fulfillment to work. But thirdly, there are many external pressures independent of marriage that still operate. The pressure to get a college education, the work that is tied to meaning, and the ability for you to fulfill your dreams and pursuits are still going to exist, regardless of whether or not what the norm of marriage is. And therefore, on their side of the house, you now have a parent that believed in all these things, wanted to climb the corporate ladder, just can't. But secondly, and here's the extension on divorce, it becomes more and more difficult to deal with it because you can't leave a family if you have such a big gap in your CV of years that you did not work. Or you might have had a college degree, but were not able to advance your career insofar as you were forced to stay at home. And therefore, not only does that either mean in a relationship that is abusive or just one that you're incredibly unhappy in, you can't leave because you can't sustain yourself. You can't have any promise you'll give a good life to your kid and therefore won't get custody. And therefore, a lot of people are trapped in these relationships where they have little to no economic power. But when you do leave, it becomes more and more difficult for you because it's likely that the job you would have otherwise gotten on our side of the house, where you did climb the corporate ladder, got more work experience, and aren't so desperate because a lot of different firms might want you, are going to be far worse, and therefore will push you and the kids you might have after divorce into economic insecurity. This is an important extension because 50% of marriages end in divorce, and I'd make the argument that not accounting for this, hanging your hat on the kid, which we prove is also better off on our side of the house, is simply far better. Moreover, professionalized industries that know how to take care of kids are far better than a parent that was just forced to take care of a kid. I am very, very proud to oppose.
Second negative for that speech, and I invite third affirmative to continue.
Guys, am I audible and visible?
Yeah.
Deep down inside, we all know that the world in the 70s and 80s were better. The way in which parents were raised, the way in which family dynamics were. The only fucked up part about it is what the fact that it was gendered, and therefore this is the thing that changes in our world today. I have three things to talk about that will prove that affirmative wins the debate. Number one, I'm going to talk about family dynamics, and number two, I'm going to talk about economic vulnerability. Two things that the negative rests their case on. And number three, I'm going to talk about raising the child and why it's far better under our side and why generally that works better. Firstly, in terms of family dynamics, just putting it out there very fast. I think it's important to understand that power dynamics do not depend on money as an absolute concept. It depends on value. In a world where value is constructed not by numbers, but by the fact that there is an overwhelming norm that suggests that raising a child is important, and therefore it is not a gendered thing, but rather one parent, regardless of the gender, should spend enough time to take care of them. It has enough value because that value comes out of a social norm. The reason why money has value, because money is a social exchange of currency, which is a norm, which means that both the norms in this world probably has equal value. We may even posit that to a certain extent, raising a child might even have a slightly higher value in this particular case, given the sacrifice that is done. Second, this means that when you have things that are equivalent in value or similar in value, you have a form of gratefulness that comes in the relationship. So you realize that this person is doing a very important job according to society, means that that gratefulness translates into that relationship because of the fact that power dynamics does not exist on the basis of that. Number three, family dynamics and relationship dynamics are actually far worse under their side because recognize what is the value under their side and they cannot run away from this. The value under their side is materialistic fulfillment, money, and so on and so forth, regardless of the reasons why this is important. In those circumstances, it is highly unlikely that both the parents are at similar levels and have similar levels of respect for each other, because of the simple fact that most people get into their relationships in their 20s, like Sajid, and at that particular point in time, when you're 25, you don't know whether or not you are going to become a CEO and your partner is probably going to be stagnant at mid management. That is something that happens all the freaking time because people become couples when they're young, and later on, a CEO does not marry another CEO, so there is always a power dynamic gap. That power dynamic gap is far worse when it cannot be filled up by a social norm, but rather the fact the absolute value of money. So the point at which you earn $20,000 more than your partner in a year, the power dynamics is literally broken. There is no mitigation to that under their side. The framing of all of this is recognize how social norms are created and why social norms are powerful. It's in schools, it's in movies, it's in literature, it's everywhere, which means social norms are ascribed value by society in so many different mechanisms that make sure that it is more balanced. Our world is more balanced. They are the ones that is weird. Unless they can prove that both the parents will earn the same amount of money in their idealistic world, they lose family dynamics in there. This is the clash that we actually win. Number two, economics of the family and why this is particularly problematic. To that, they say, oh, but if you work, then you're necessarily not taking care of the child. We realize that taking care of the child is something that takes a lot of time. And in a lot of cases, in the first 4 years, you may not be able to work. But after that, after a particular point in time, you realize that the child is probably going to school for 6 to 7 6 to 7 hours a day, 5 times a week. In those circumstances, you're probably able to invest 2 to 3 hours of your time into Facebook, into the small business that you want to run, maybe a gardening business that you want to run out of your backyard. In those circumstances, you're able to mitigate the problem of money because you're more likely to be middle class in those circumstances and able to do this in a way such that it probably, yes, you probably end up earning $10,000 less yearly, but you're still able to earn some money, which mitigates the worst of harms coming in there. But number two, no response to Sajid's analysis of in the worst case scenario, when people are so desperate that they have to work and both of them have to work, they actually they don't care about social norms because biological needs are prior to social norms. That's how like Maslow's hierarchy of needs occur. So I don't think the worst case happens in either way. But I'm actually going to, because I'm good at economics, I'm actually going to win the economics class. Macroeconomic dynamics and why this is particularly important in this particular case. And why the 70s and 80s were particularly better economically. Why were people more equal relatively in economics when it comes to the 70s and 80s? Because of the simple reason, the labor market, when you have too much supply, actually gives the power back to people who are employing labor. By that, I mean, in the current world, minimum wage is set in a way where both parents have to work per hour, and then you calculate minimum wage on the basis of two parents, and that's how a family can run. So minimum wage in any country is set according to if two people in a family earn, can they run a family? In a world where it's one person, the minimum wage is calculated on the basis of if one person can run a family. And this is not on the basis of this assumption, but this is on the basis of labor market dynamics, because the supply of labor shrinks at that particular point in time, and means that in those circumstances, you do that in order to calculate things like minimum wage, because the bargaining power of laborers is far higher when their supply is little bit limited. In those circumstances, minimum wage is likely to be set in a way that you are able to run a family. Number two, demographic dividend. You are likely to have less children if you have to work and raise a child at the same time. It's more draining to do that. If you have more time to raise a child, you're probably likely to have two children at once, which means the problems that like countries like Japan and other Nordic countries have with regards to like there being a generation that is less than the other generation. In those circumstances, I think it's just 5 minutes. Sorry, I got an alert of 6, but just 5 minutes here. But okay, regardless. In case of demographic dividend, it is more important that when it comes to like reduction of children from one generation to another, it is more possible that you have two child, which replaces the population, which means the welfare pressures that come from demographic dividend problems do not exist in our world because you have more children that are replacing them, which means less economic pressure. So overall, I think it's better economically in our world, at least in a macroeconomic sense and labor market sense. But more importantly, the fact that automation is happening means that you have more unemployment problems if you have a bigger labor supply. If you have less unemployment problems, then generally speaking, you have an economy that does better. When it comes to raising the kid, I think it's important to note a few things in this particular case. Number one, they suggest that everything is going to be fixed by like a demand-supply equation because of the fact that there's a high demand for childcare. Somehow supply is going to replace it and it's going to have research, etc., etc. Do you know what else has inelastic demand in the world today? Schools and education. I would posit that in vast majority of the world, including in developed countries like United States of America and so on and so forth, especially in other developing countries, schools are actually not that great, even though it has inelastic supply, because of the simple reason that individuals having certain skill sets in any society is very limited. So your ability to be able to raise a child to a large extent, not just raise a child, by the way, raise 20 people's skills at the same time, because that's what daycare by definition is very limited. The number of people who are able to do that is very limited. We say that vast majority of people get overwhelmed by one kid because kids are pesky and annoying. That's just a fact. In those cases, it does mean that demand and supply does not equalize. But secondly, I'd like to posit that any individual's capacity to raise a child, give them attention, is something that is finite and the ability is somewhat restricted. However, the mitigating factors that comes is the fact that you have a biological connection to that kid, the fact that you have a connection to that kid because that kid is yours. You are less likely to care about the sensitivities of a child if that child is not yours. And this applies to the neighbors taking care of the kid. This applies to other grandparents taking care of the kid. This applies to daycare centers that are not as well endowed as other daycare centers, because guess what? Inequality exists in all worlds. In those circumstances, it is more likely that someone who is a mediocre daycare worker will pass on some form of trauma unknowingly to the child, because guess what? Children traumatize easily than a parent who has that connection that mitigates that. If the parent and the daycare worker are equally likely to pass on some trauma to the child, the parent is less likely to do that because of the fact that only one person is getting the attention, and also because of the fact that there are other mitigating factors that connect the child to the parent. But more importantly, given that we are assuming that there are progressive norms existing in society, progressive norms of parenting are existing in society. This is incredibly important because note what we are saying in this particular case. At the expense of, say, $10,000 reduction in your annual income, you're getting more children that are less traumatized by their childhood because of the fact that they have an emotional connection to their parents, because of the fact that they are generally taken better care of in terms of better currency of attention that is given. Children love attention, and that is something that is just a fact. And all of the analysis coming in from first F with regards to the connection with the parent and the child goes unresponded throughout the debate. Incredibly proud to affirm.
Make her affirmative, and I invite the negative to continue.
Hi, I'm going to assume everything's audible and visible. If anything's wrong, just tell me. Okay, great. Start in 3, 2, 1. I don't know about you, panel, but the 70s and 80s certainly were not better for the battered wives who had no ability to leave their alcoholic husbands, for the children who had to drop out of schools because their dad got laid off and their mom had no savings, for the people who had no maternity leave because it was a fiction when women were told they should just quit and become the parent who stays at home instead. They can pin these problems on sexism. We say they are inherent to the setup of a one-income household, and their failure to respond to this down the bench has already lost them the debate. I want to talk about two things. I want to firstly show why we quite clearly win their issue on the well-being of the child, then I want to expand the debate and talk about the impact on parents, which I think are an equally valuable stakeholder. Before any of that, I want to deal with all of this macroeconomic analysis. First, I want to point out there's a lot of outright building at WIP. The extent of their argument as second half is to suggest that the parents' ability to access jobs decreases, not about the demographic dividend stuff. If anything, the fact that there is a demographic winter actually fixes the labor supply problems, since less people are born over time and there's not such a large demand for childcare workers, which is their problem. But even then, this misses the point that a norm comes with an increase in jobs because people access more income and are more able to consume stuff over time, which responds to their quote unquote good economic analysis that in the labor market, a supply increase is bad for workers. We explain that you expand the market and thus the supply of jobs. But most importantly, don't credit any of this because the most important thing is if their problem is that people cannot get employed, the worst case is their side where only one parent is able to be employed. So you can't credit any of this as actually changing the margin of the debate. If anything, it just shows why their side is worse. Let's firstly talk about the well-being of the child, because I think AF's only claim in this debate is to say that the child will be neglected. The first and simplest response to this is they never demonstrate why it's about the quantity of attention. My parents weren't there for me 24/7, but I still love them because they were there when it mattered. What matters to the child is about the quality of attention, and we explain that the quality of attention is better when parents don't see child rearing as something that comes at the cost of their own personal aspirations. We've all had that experience where we're with our moms physically, but we don't believe that they love us. We think that they're neglecting us, or where we think their parents view us in a negative light or as a burden on them that just causes them additional stress because they're with us so frequently and we have norms that push us towards independence. We suggest that it's far better on our side where children don't feel suffocated and structures grow to allow parents to form a passive role that better supports their kids. Secondly, we explain that the norm in our world is what creates structures that allow parents to spend more time with their kids, like the expansion of childcare support, like the improvement of those services over time, which means they don't traumatize their children, but further that they give this response themselves at first and pedal back from it in the latter half of their case. Workplaces become more accommodating. They let you work from home, because they know that you have to take care of that child and both of you have to do it, rather than assuming that one parent can quit and take on their burden for themselves. At the end of those responses, what we demonstrate is that the threshold for attention is low and is largely mitigable because it is the quality of attention that matters, and that significantly improves under that side. What are you weighing that against? Which are all the ways the child is made to suffer in their world. First, all of the economic and personal shocks that befall the family, a parent falling ill, losing their jobs, having no savings, and the constant crippling economic anxiety that you only have one breadwinner to rely on. The response from second, that they'll forget about social norms once they're at crisis point, absolutely misses our argument. It's not not about, because it's much harder for you to seek employment once you are at that crisis point. It's much harder for you to seek employment once you've been out of the workforce for such a long time, when you don't have the savings because you weren't proactively encouraged to go to the workforce. But even then, it's about the structures that exist in that workforce to support you. It's whether or not your employer is understanding about the fact that you will both have to work and that you can't, and you have to take care of a child at the same time. If anything, I think this context of situations where parents are poor and have to work proves that the world is better on our side. If it's true that these are the most vulnerable parents with the most vulnerable families, it's better that the norms support them and support that type of structure rather than a world that constantly discriminates against them because they are the outlier. The second thing you are weighing against is the fact that parents just end up hating each other so much more because of their inability to relate, destroying any ability the child has to feel loved and receive quality attention. They say parents value each other equally. No, because it's about how you perceive each other's value. If it is the case that you do not do the domestic work yourself, you have no experience of what it's like to raise a child or wash their clothes, or you have no experience of what it's like to work a grueling 9-to-5 job, it's incredibly unlikely that you will see the other parent as equally valuable as you are. If anything, all of their analysis as to why it's bad if one parent earns more than the other proves that the tension is exacerbated when one parent is earning literally nothing and there's now no longer any common ground for them to negotiate each other's value and explain the things they do and why they matter to the child. All of that demonstrates that it's not, the attention claim they have is largely mitigable and falls out of the round and falls to the two other pieces of unresponded material we give. Let's secondly then talk about the impact on the parents. And they try to neglect this, but I really don't think they can. The vulnerability and weight of the child as they concede diminishes as they grow more independent, grow older, and form their own social groups. What this debate comes down to then is the well-being of the parents will be strapped in that family structure even once the child has left. Let's first break it down for the child, for the parent who has to go to work. Their contention is that you're more fulfilled when you escape the capitalist rat race and no longer base your value on your income. First, they never demonstrate why you have any capacity to do that. In fact, what we argue all the way from David is you are entrenched in this capitalist structure from the moment you were born. You go to university, you dream of a career, and it's unlikely that when you are told to drop everything, that you are just going to accept that for a strange little human being that came out of you. It's more likely that you feel constant niggling guilt and doubt about your ability to succeed, as we explained from Mikko, which means you still judge yourself by those same capitalist standards that they say are so awful, but you fail to meet them at any extent. Because instead of being able to say that at least I'm able to make some income, at least I'm doing a job I love, even if my income isn't that high and it fulfills me personally, I'm no longer doing anything and I'm forced to sacrifice everything. The second thing they say is you are going to fail the corporate ladder. I would suggest that it's just so much worse when you view yourself as the only caretaker for that family. E.g., I am failing as a breadwinner. I am failing the one thing I have. I don't even have a connection to my child to fall back on. Compared to a world where you are also taking care of the child and you can possibly rationalize your failure at work. You can say things like, well, it's because I have to make sacrifices for my kid that I can't achieve the top positions. I can't be a manager. I can't get every promotion. And that's okay with me because I'm still in a fulfilling role. The final thing they say on this is to say you don't earn the same amount. As I already explained, you use that and apply it to a family where only one partner makes bank, and it's so much worse because of that income inequality and tension. What happens to the parent who stays at home? There are two things that go unresponded to. First, there's no response to the fact that you strip them of an opt-out. You strip them of the ability to leave the most toxic and harmful situations. They might try to say in reply that this is a minority of cases. I think it's a minority that matters, because when the relationship is falling apart and you realize that you have no ability to earn an income on your own, no networks to get a job, no skills that you can market yourself on, the alternative is to stay in a deeply unhappy and traumatizing relationship for the rest of your years. But second, there's no response to the fact that you lose your ability to express your frustrations and communicate what is wrong in the first place. This is what forces parents apart, because they don't have an ability to understand each other or an ability to ask their partner to try and live in their shoes for a moment and try to see what it's like on their side of things. Instead, you get despondence and you get apathy where these issues aren't communicated over time and the family falls apart for both of them. We show that the world is far worse when you raise a family in a structure of neglect, and for those reasons, the game.
Negative. The negative, and I invite negative reply.
Hello, can everyone hear me?
Yep.
Great. Start my start my speech in 3, 2, 1. The problem with the affirming team is they do not build their world as well as they build a third. The first thing I want to talk about is the child. The underlying premise of this argument is that you have a parent that has more time and loves the kid, and what we explain is that there are many alternatives as child rearing services that get cheaper over time as more people opt into them and firms try and enter the market. Many reasons why our comparative is better. Firstly, they say parents love the kid and won't pass on trauma. One, it's just incredibly assertive that a childcare worker will just explain all the trauma to the kid, and it's unclear as to why that is going to occur regardless. But what we explain is they don't explain the counterfactual of, is love a sufficient reason as to why parents would be so capable in taking care of their kids? One, what we explain is that many parents would have pursued a career regardless, and therefore when you're forced to become a parent or work in the household, you're often unequipped. Versus on our side of the house, a professional who is trained and is well informed about the nature of child rearing is much likely to be a better parent. Secondly, when you give up your ambitions for a kid, it's more likely you build resentment towards the family. This is the one that stopped you from pursuing your degree in your corporate job, and now you're just stuck at home. It's not clear why that love manifests in ways that can't also be hurtful, because love in itself is not enough for parents, because love can often be used in very many malicious ways. But thirdly, insofar as parents love the kid, then all the alternatives, like picking the best person to take care of them, picking the best daycare service, the best nanny, etc., that is most adapted to your circumstances, is also likely to occur, and therefore it's unclear why they were any better just with love and with time. Secondly, parents fight. They say a third, that you are going to have equal value towards each other. This is incredibly assertive. One, again, absolute worst case, where a CEO is going to marry someone of such lower income, when I think most marriages are probably going to be of relatively equal social circles. But secondly, we clarify at third half a couple of things. The first is that we have so many reasons that like the value might be equal in theory, but not be equal in terms of perception. I.e., what I perceive to be my partner's value can have very large differences. If you've never washed the dishes or know how difficult household work is gonna be, but you know how hard it is in the office, you might think, I'm doing so much more than my partner. Why are they contributing anything? And especially as we explained from first neg, that you have such different lived realities, that it's so difficult to relate and understand each other's struggles, it then becomes more difficult to understand and explain each other, and therefore you're more likely to cause infighting. But secondly, is that there's still a capitalist structure that exists on either side of the debate. So if you can threaten to leave, but another person can't because they can't sustain themselves, that causes fighting. This emotionally ruins the child. Thirdly, we name a myriad of other reasons that I don't think get a fair response. First, that when you improve someone's economic circumstances, you take away a lot of the anxieties that poverty and the lack of economic security provides for you. Secondly, that if you were in a neighborhood that wasn't so good, that if you were in a school that wasn't so good, an additional income might change the environment that they say can push you to drugs, can push you to rebels, and therefore are more likely to ensure that you live a better life as a consequence. But thirdly, that the imbalance in parental presence is so incredibly damaging to a kid because you can interpret that negatively. Whereas what we explain at third is that you can change the way in which you perceive parental presence as quality and not just quantity. And we also explain why just the fear of abandonment, that your parents don't like being around one another, which is why one is around more often than the other, and therefore makes you doubt your own parents' love, more likely to harm the child. But secondly, there's very little response on parents, which one, we explain throughout the bench, trickles down into how they might treat the child, and therefore they don't sufficiently respond to this issue. But secondly, when most marriages end in divorce, when most marriages are going to, obviously involve two people who are like parents and spouses to one another, they don't explain why people can't get out of a relationship they're unhappy with when they can't sustain themselves, when there's such a big gap in their CV, and therefore it is so difficult for you to leave a very, very terrible marriage. But when you do, you are screwed because you don't have the ability to sustain yourself further on. So, on all accounts of this debate, I think they make it a single issue debate that I think they also comprehensively lose, but also they under-mechanize the reasons by which parental love is sufficient at all for parental success. What we explain is that alternatives are better and that this can be interpreted in so many bad ways for the same impressionable child they talk about. I'm very proud to oppose.
Thanks for negative reply for that speech, and I invite Affirmative reply to conclude the debate.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
My speech in 3, 2, 1. It's really funny that third neg and neg reply say that after rebuilding that entirely different case in second neg, it's really unfair for third app to give new responses. I don't think that's how debating works, guys. Whips are allowed to make responses to arguments. But I would also posit that the way in which they frame their case is really funny, because a lot of the benefits that they're weighing later on is dependent on an idea of quality, right? Like after work, you can spend time with your child. But for some reason, after taking care of your child, they also respond to us by saying, we can't earn money at all, right? Like, so surely that's not the comparative that you have to hedge this case on. And it's not what we're hedging this case on. From first app to third app, what we defended is quality. We talked about how even in the best case of neg, the ways in which you take care of a child are not through actors that can provide the same quality that a parent can. It is an issue of quality. And we've also explained why it's not just a harm of affection at an early age, even though that is a very important harm that impacts the mental health of a child forever. It's also the way in which you interact, form moral teachings, protect the child as the child grows up, understand how you have to build that relationship, make sure that you're someone that the child can reach out to and share feelings to, not allow the child to resort to external actors. They don't really respond to why this actor or the child is not the most important actor. They do say, and they do concede that it is the most important actor, but they tend to make arguments about other actors like parents anyway. So first of all, I'd like to point out that since they concede this, their other arguments are less important and not debate deciding because they themselves conceded that the child is the most vulnerable. Secondly, their only response to child rearing then resorted to money is the most important way in which you raise a child. The first thing I'd like to posit is it's a comparison of what is more important, the extent of money or just some money versus a complement of the quality parenting that these children get. The only explanation for this was the fact that we can still ensure quality by virtue of these nannies, with no analysis of why that is comparable quality. But the way in which we responded to this was ensuring a high quality product, even if there's a demand, would require you to pay exorbitant amounts of money in order to access it. So that not only that mitigates the way in which you want to benefit the child in the alternative as well. But the other part of the debate that they absolutely lose is the way in which the roles of these parents, when it is benefiting the child, eventually plays out. Because the way in which they explain it is to suggest that when you have two separate roles, because these social norms are perverse, there's one actor that always loses out. We've told you why that is unlikely to be true in a world that is not gendered. And this is because you don't understand what the other role is, you're more likely to view it as a complement to you rather than hostile to you. This is, again, by the way, something said in second half, in case they point that out again. And we've also pointed out how in the best case scenario, you can't get the same amount of money, which creates the same level of infighting that impacts the child as well. There was no tertiary response coming from third neg or second neg to any of this argument. They did concede the capitalistic structure is perverse. The only thing they then resort to is to suggest that at least you feel good that you still contribute somewhat. But this goes back to a more fundamental question. What is the value of a social norm then? There was no explanation of why, because this social norm exists, we've explained both in second half, first half, and third half that there are reasons why these parents will feel fulfilled by virtue of their ability to raise their child. If they believe that there are naturalistic tendencies to, want to be capitalistic, we surely can also argue that there are naturalistic tendencies to be close to your child that gives you fulfillment as well. That's not how you weigh the debate. You weigh the debate on a functional basis. Post that fulfillment, what is most likely to translate in the real world in interaction between parents and how they benefit the child. That's where they clearly lose this debate. Thank you very much.
I thank all speakers for the debate. And